The wind came down Deadmare Ridge like an old voice trying to speak, part sorrow, part warning. She always said the wind had moods. On certain days, it whispered like the breath of a lover lost too soon. On others, it cried like something dying on the prairie. But on that day, as Clara Bellwether stood with one hand resting on the porch post and the other gripping a chipped tin mug of cold coffee, it came down with a voice rough as gravel and sharp as old memory. She watched it stir the dust across the ridge and trail smoke from the chimney sideways, like a finger pointing west. The coffee had gone bitter, but she drank it anyway. The wind carried more than dust that day. It carried the weight of a name unspoken for too long. That morning, Clara had boiled 2 eggs and set 2 plates on the table. The second remained untouched, same as always. She didn't call it habit anymore, just faith with a stubborn streak. She thought of the words he'd murmured the last time he'd crossed that threshold, early morning light catching in his beard like gold in a creek bed. "I'll be back before the cold sets in." That had been 2 winters ago. The cold had come and gone twice, and Clara had stopped counting seasons. She still wore his coat some evenings, still scrubbed the porch with the same bristle brush he'd used. Still mended the busted hinges on the barn door, because he always said creaking wood made the cattle nervous, even if there weren't any cattle left to startle. The ranch hadn't been much, even when Jedediah was alive. 40 acres of brittle grass, a rotting barn leaned too far east, and a cabin built back when men cut trees by hand and sealed the cracks with horsehair and spit. The roof leaked, the door stuck, and the wind had its way with the shutters. Still, it was home. Folks in Bitter Wash had long since given up asking about Jedediah. First they offered condolences, then came the awkward glances, the forced small talk in the general store. These days, most didn't talk at all, just the occasional nod or glance when she brought in eggs or dry herbs to trade for coffee and salt. Old Mr. Gaunt at the Mercantile had said it plain a week prior. "Might be time to let go, Miss Clara." Men who don't send word ain't often among the living. He wouldn't look her in the eye when he said it, just scooped cornmeal into a sack and tied it off with too much string. She'd left without replying. What did they know of promises made on windswept porches, of a silver cross worn close to the chest, warm from prayer and sweat? What did they know of her man's silence? Not death. Not yet. Jedediah Bellwether was simply delayed. So, she waited. Every dusk, she watched the ridge. Every morning, she boiled water for 2. She didn't wear black. That was for widows. She wore the same faded blue blouse he liked best, even though it was frayed now, mended at the cuffs, and smelled faintly of mothballs and iron. Every stitch held something of him. That day, the clouds had rolled in thick and sudden, the way they did when spring turned wild in the canyonlands. The sky cracked wide open, spilling a hard, hammering rain that flattened what little grass clung to life. Clara didn't retreat. She stood on the porch, coffee in hand, hair soaked through, letting the rain wash over her like confession. Thunder rolled across the basin like distant cannon fire. She closed her eyes and listened, half waiting to hear his voice in the echo. But the sound that came next wasn't thunder. It was a hoofbeat, not the lazy clop of a stray mule or the erratic stumble of a trader's nag. This was steady, purposeful, deliberate. A rhythm she knew. She set her cup on the railing. Slow and careful, her breath caught halfway to her lungs. The path to her ranch was nothing but a ribbon of rocks and dry thorns. No one came this way, unless they meant to. The sound grew louder. A shape emerged from the rain like something pulled from a fever dream. A black horse, tall as sin, steam rising from its flanks, mane lashing wild in the storm. Her knees buckled. "Ashwind," she whispered, gripping the porch post for balance. It was him, no doubt. The white streak over his left eye, The scar on his shoulder where a barbed fence once caught him back in '67. Jedediah's warhorse, more spirit than flesh, that animal. But Ashwind wasn't alone. The rider sat tall despite the storm, coat soaked through, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low to shade his face. He didn't rush. He didn't raise a hand. Just let the rain fall, the silence grow heavier. Clara stepped off the porch and moved toward the door. Her fingers found the Henry rifle, warm from its place near the hearth. She walked back out, lifted the barrel, and pointed it straight. "That's my horse," she said, steady and sure. "Where'd you get him?" The man dismounted slow, hands raised. He moved with the weariness of someone too tired to lie, but too careful to tell the whole truth. "I didn't steal him," he said. His voice was sandpaper, rough, almost broken. "Ashwind, don't wander," she snapped. He nodded, eyes on hers. 3 weeks back," he said. "He found me near dead in a canyon pass, stood over me like he knew me." He reached into his coat, slow, cautious, and pulled out a cloth bundle, tossed it to her feet. Clara didn't lower the rifle. She used one hand to unwrap it. Fingers trembling, a silver cross, dull with age, the leather cord still worn where it had rubbed against Jedediah's collarbone. Her throat closed tight. "Where's my husband?" she asked. The man removed his hat. His face was lean, lined by hardship, not a face she recognized, but his eyes. His eyes held something deep, something bruised. "He died in the war," he said almost gently. But he didn't die in vain. The storm softened. Rain fell quieter now, more like mourning than rage. Clara kept the rifle up. "What are you to him?" The man didn't answer right away. He looked past her, like he saw something long gone. "He saved my life. More than once," he said. "Told me about this place. About you. Said if anything happened, I was to bring the horse back. And the cross." He looked down, jaw tight. "Your man was a scout. We were caught in Virginia. Prison camp held us longer than the war should have lasted. Most of our boys never made it out." Clara's eyes searched his face. Looking for cracks, lies, cowardice. But the pain was real, heavy as thunder. "Why now?" she asked. "Why not months ago?" "I didn't know if I'd make it out," he said. "And I had something to finish." Then he swayed. It happened fast. His knees gave, one hand catching the fence rail, the other clutching his side. Rain darkened the cloth, but darker still was the patch blooming red beneath. "You're bleeding," she said. He didn't answer, just leaned harder against the wood. Her fingers stayed near the trigger, mind reeling, heart racing. War taught her not to trust easy. Grief taught her to trust even less. But she didn't lower the rifle. She didn't raise it either. Finally, she stepped forward. "Get inside, before you fall over." He looked up, eyes soft with something like gratitude. Then he staggered toward the porch. Clara opened the door with one hand, the other still gripping the cross. As he passed, she looked down at the object in her palm. Jedediah was gone. But something of him had returned, and the wind, for the first time in years, carried not just sorrow, but change. "I should kill you where you stand," Clara whispered, rain dripping off the barrel of her rifle. "But the cross says not yet." The fire cracked low as Clara sewed flesh back together, not for love, but for war's unfinished work. Rain tapped against the windows with the steadiness of a metronome, the kind Jedediah once used to time his pocket watch when they still believed in schedules. Outside, the storm had softened to a weeping wind, but inside the cabin, time had twisted into something slow and strange. The lantern threw soft halos across the wood floor. Dust hung in the air like smoke. Somewhere between that silence and the faint hum of dampness in the walls, the stranger sat slouched at her kitchen table, bleeding into the last good shirt he'd probably ever own. He didn't groan, didn't wince, just sat there, watching her thread the needle, his lips pressed together and his jaw set like stone. Clara had seen wounds before, on Jedediah, on neighbors who came back from the war too early or too late. She knew the look of a man who was halfway to the grave and not ready to be pulled back. This one wasn't dying, not yet, but he was close enough to feel it. The cut along his side was deep, a graze perhaps, but a savage one, with the kind of bruising that meant something had torn more than just skin. "You're lucky it didn't go deeper," she muttered, wiping the edge of the gash with a cloth steeped in boiled pine resin and alcohol. "Another inch, and it'd be you riding the storm instead of into it." "I've had worse," he said, his voice low and dry as dust. "This ain't the time for that, anyhow." She didn't answer, didn't look him in the eyes. Her hands worked fast, not gentle, not cruel, just efficient. She had stitched saddle leather and chicken bellies. Skin was no different when you learned not to flinch. A silence filled the room, thick and coiled like a rattler. She felt it in her throat, in her knuckles. The weight of 100 questions pressed on her ribs, but she kept them there, unsaid. He broke the stillness first. "He told me about you, Jedediah." Clara paused, thread tight in her fingers. "He said you wouldn't wait forever, that you were strong, but that waiting would make you brittle." Her jaw clenched. He didn't know a damn thing about waiting. The man's eyes dropped to the floor, dark lashes casting shadows on cheeks streaked with road dust. "No," he said. "But I do." She pulled the thread tight. The skin pinched, and he hissed, just barely. She went on sewing. "Where were you when it happened?" she asked, her voice quiet but sharp. "Virginia. Behind the lines. We were scouts, Jedediah and me, and 6 others." He swallowed. "They caught us near a river, mud up to our thighs, guns wet, no way to run." Her fingers didn't pause. "They took us to a camp, not the kind they write about. A place where names stopped mattering, and every sunrise felt like punishment." She tied off the stitch. "He was still talking about you, even when the others stopped speaking at all." Still she said nothing, just reached for the clean cloth and began wiping the blood from his ribs. "I didn't lie to you," he said. "Not about the cross, not about Ashwind. Jedediah made me promise. If he didn't walk out, I was to ride here, bring back what mattered." "And what mattered was his horse?" she asked. Bitter. "No," the man said. "What mattered was you." She stopped wiping. There was a breath between them, maybe longer, maybe years. He looked up at her then, eyes glinting like wet stone. "I'm not here for your forgiveness," he said. "I'm here because I owed a man something. I aim to pay it, then go." "That's mighty noble of you," she said, stepping back. Her gaze never left him. His shoulders slumped slightly, exhaustion creeping through every muscle. "You didn't answer my question." "What question was that? What really happened to Jedediah?" He was silent for a long time. Then his voice came, rougher than before. "He died saving me. It was a fool mistake. We saw movement. Thought it was one of ours. He stepped in front before I could say anything." Clara clenched her jaw. "He said he was coming back." "I know. He promised. I know he did." His voice cracked then. "But sometimes a promise ain't enough to beat a bullet." The fire popped, sending sparks up the chimney. She turned her face away, blinking hard. She finished cleaning the wound in silence, folded the cloths, packed the kit, all with movements that had become second nature, the kind you do when your mind is far away, wandering trails that only the heart remembers. "You've been lying to me," she said finally, voice low, his brow furrowed. "What makes you say that?" "You told me he died in the war, but not how. And now you ride in, near dead yourself on his horse, with a wound you won't explain, and expect me to believe you're just passing through?" He didn't answer. She folded her arms. "Who are you, really?" He looked at her, tired and old in the firelight. "Just a man with nowhere else to go." "You want something?" He shook his head slowly. "I had something to finish." "And what was that?" He looked down. "A man like me don't get to leave things half done, not after men better than me died trying." Her eyes narrowed. "So you came here to die?" He lifted his shoulders faintly. "If I'm being honest, maybe." Clara turned away from him, pacing once before she stopped at the window. The storm had passed, but the air still smelled of lightning and churned dirt. In the distance, the land stretched out in dark shapes and softer edges. "You don't have to stay," she said, "but you can't leave. Not like this." He said nothing, just sat, hands resting on his knees, blood dried along his ribs. She looked back at him. "I should hate you." "You probably should." "But I don't." He blinked. "I don't trust you," she added, voice harder. "But I see what it did to you. The war, the loss." She walked past him to the fireplace, adjusted the poker, sent up a few sparks. "You're not here to take his place," she said half to herself. "I wouldn't try," he murmured. She turned. "Then what are you here for?" He met her eyes. "To make sure he didn't die for nothing." Clara stared at him. The cross lay on the table between them. Ashwin's bridle hung by the door. Jedediah's coat, the one with the frayed hem and bullet-scratched buttons, hung limp on the wall like a ghost's shadow. "Then you're not here to help me," she said. Silas Mercer nodded. "I'm here to help you survive, whether you want it or not." Outside, the storm had truly passed. A breeze tugged at the window shutter, sending a soft moan through the eaves. Inside, the room was still, warmed by fire, haunted by memory, and somewhere down the trail, a new kind of storm was rising. "We're looking for a man. Rode a black cavalry horse and bled from his side." They came with hollow eyes and silver lies, the kind of men who leave bones behind and never write their names. Dusk lay like a slow hand on the ridge, drawing long shadows across the split-rail fence and burying the horizon in smudges of ochre and ash. The wind had gone soft again, shifting from its earlier howl into something more unsettling, a whisper that never quite reached the ear. Like the breath of someone watching from just beyond the trees. Inside the cabin, Clara Bellwether sat near the fire, her rifle laid across her knees. Her shoulders had relaxed only slightly since the storm ended, and the man, Silas Mercer, he'd finally called himself, was now resting upright in the corner chair with a can of peaches opened beside him. He hadn't eaten much, and she suspected it had more to do with memory than pain. The stitched wound on his side had begun to darken at the edges, the skin puffing in protest, but he said nothing. Neither did she. It had been 3 days since Ashwind carried Silas out of the rain and into her world. 3 days of silence and half-spoken truths. The cross still sat on the mantel. The coat still hung by the door. Clara hadn't moved them. She hadn't touched anything at all, as if altering the air too much might break whatever thin thread remained of her husband's presence. She had grown used to that thread, to its fragility, to the ache of it stretching taut with every passing day. But tonight, the tension in the air came from elsewhere. Leaning forward, she stirred the contents of the pot hanging over the hearth, beans and cracked corn with a bit of leftover pork rind, all boiled into something humble, but filling. She didn't ask if he was hungry, didn't serve him. She ladled out 2 bowls and set them both on the table. "Thank you," Silas said, voice low, his eyes catching the flicker of firelight but not her gaze. She didn't reply, just sat and sipped slowly, watching him over the rim of her spoon. At last, she spoke. "They were bounty men, weren't they?" Silas didn't flinch, just set his bowl down slow and breathed through his nose. Yes. Looking for you? He gave a nod so slight it might have been the shadow of one. Clara exhaled through her teeth. Why? He rubbed a thumb over the edge of the table. Because I carry something a man named Horace Gatlin wants, and Gatlin's the sort who don't like to ask twice. Name's familiar. He's got fingers in freight lines, mine shafts, some say the railroads too. Was a smuggler once. Turned himself respectable by moving Confederate gold west and bribing judges with silver. And you crossed him. I rode with a man who did. The cabin fell quiet again. She leaned back in her chair, arms folded. Jedediah. Silas met her eyes. Yes. She waited, refusing to offer him an easy way through the telling. After a moment, he stood, slow, careful, and stepped toward the fireplace. From behind the hearth's brick edge, he pulled up a loose floorboard, dragging something wrapped in oilskin from beneath the slats. Clara rose, wary. He laid it on the table and unrolled it. Inside was an old hand-drawn map, the ink faded but clear. Thick lines traced canyon trails, dry riverbeds, narrow switchbacks only known to scouts and smugglers. At the center, marked in red, was a single X buried deep in a place labeled Devil's Back Gulch. Her breath caught. I've seen this place, she whispered. Silas nodded. Jedediah found it while riding scout routes. Said Gatlin buried something there after the war. Silver, maybe. Maybe more. Jedediah took a copy of the trail. Didn't tell anyone, just tucked it away. Clara stared at the lines. He never spoke of this. He didn't want to. Said some truths weren't ready yet. She traced a finger along the trail. Dust Creek, Bitter Wash. And their ridge. You still haven't told me why they're after you. Silas leaned against the table, grimacing. Because I have this. And because I didn't give it to them. She looked up sharply. Why not? He shrugged. Because your husband died for it. And because Gatlin's kind don't deserve to own what men bled to protect. She stepped back from the table. The room swam with heat, memory, and something heavier. You came here with that, she asked. Knowing they'd follow? I didn't mean to bring danger to your door. But you did. Silas's jaw tightened. He told me to come here. Her chest ached with something she couldn't name. She wanted to hit him, to weep, to scream, but all she did was stare. He gestured toward the map. We can run. Pack up and ride before dawn. I can lead them off. Maybe it'll be enough. No, she said. No? She stepped closer, voice low. This land, these canyons, they're mine. I know every bluff, every dry wash, every choke point. She looked down at the map again. We don't run. Silas watched her for a long moment. Then a flicker of something crossed his eyes. Not surprise, not admiration. Something softer. Then we fight, he said. They spent the rest of the evening preparing. Clara led him along the ridge where the brush grew thick and the rocks gave good cover. They passed the old grain cave Jedediah used to store supplies, a dark hollow in the stone wall that stayed cool even in summer. Perfect for ambush, she said. They rigged false trails with scraped boot tracks and bent branches. They buried snare wire under fresh dirt near the gulch and placed rocks where they'd slide underfoot. She showed him how the canyon funneled sound, how a gunshot from the cabin would echo for miles in one direction, but not the other. By nightfall, they had set traps, built lookouts, and carved the land into a chessboard. Back at the cabin, she stood alone on the porch, the rifle across her lap. The sky above was thick with stars, the moon a pale coin balanced on the edge of the world. Inside, Silas cleaned his blade in silence. The air was quiet, but it wasn't peace. At last, she spoke. You still haven't told me your name. He looked up, firelight dancing on the edge of his expression. Name's Silas, he said. She nodded slowly, gaze never leaving the night. You're going to need to remember who you are out here, Silas. You're not just a soldier anymore." His voice was quiet. "No. Now I'm a dead unpaid." She stood, walked back inside, and hung Jedediah's coat near the door. "No," she said. "You're a reckoning." Outside, the wind picked up again, dry and sharp, chasing moonlight across the ridge. Somewhere in the distance, the coyotes were silent, the kind of silence that warned more than any sound. And down the canyon, 3 riders came. Clara brushed dust from Jedediah's war coat and slipped it over her shoulders. "Let them come," she whispered. "I'm done waiting." In the desert before dawn, even silence has a sound, like boots on dry leaves, or justice waking in its bones. The last of the stars were still out when Clara stepped barefoot onto the porch, her rifle already slung across her back. The ground held the night's chill, and the air carried a promise, not of peace, but of reckoning. The sky, low and bruised, hadn't yet shifted to color. That thin veil of gray that came before dawn wrapped the land like old smoke, and Clara could hear the land breathing. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a hawk let out one long cry. Then, stillness. She glanced toward the hollowed trail where the brush gave way to jagged stone, then to the cave, nestled like a secret in the cliffside. 100 paces east, Silas was already in position, crouched behind a slab of crumbling rock shaped like a broken saddle horn. She couldn't see him, but she knew he was there. Had watched him move into place hours earlier, his body limping but steady, like a man who'd carried death too far and too long. The traps were laid. The bait was set. And now, all they had to do was wait. Clara's heart didn't race. Her hands didn't tremble. In another life, she might have been afraid. But fear was something she had already buried, right next to patience and old prayers. Behind her, the cabin stood still and ready, its windows boarded, the door slightly ajar, just enough to invite foolishness. She breathed in through her nose, smelled mesquite and dust, the ghost of yesterday's coffee, and something else riding low in the air. Smoke. They were coming. The sound came slowly, not galloping, not charging. Just the creak of saddles, the thud of hooves muffled by dry grass and worn boots scraping stone. Clara crouched low, rifle resting against the railing, her cheek pressed to the cool grain of the wood. She saw them first by silhouette, 3 of them, like bad memories riding in single file. The sun hadn't broken the horizon yet, but their shadows stretched long already. Wrong kind of men, with wrong kind of eyes. The first was broad-shouldered, with a flat-brimmed hat and a long duster. That would be the one Silas called Levi Creel, quiet, watchful, dangerous in the way wolves are dangerous. The second, younger and twitchy, rode hunched over like a buzzard expecting a carcass. His hand kept brushing the butt of his pistol as if it itched. His name, they'd learned, was Toby Finch, and last came the third, tall and too clean, with a smile that didn't belong in the dirt. This one, she knew, was the talker. Cain, they'd called him. Or maybe he'd called himself that. He had the kind of face that lied easily. They approached slowly, eyes scanning the ridge and brush with calculated calm. Toby's horse shied once, caught the scent of something, blood or steel, but the rider yanked hard on the reins and whispered curses through his teeth. They didn't see her. Not yet. But they would. From her perch, Clara waited until the 3 dismounted just outside the split rail, like they had every right to step across that line. Cain led the way, his boots crunching on the gravel. Clara's finger curled tighter on the trigger. Behind the ridge, Silas held his breath. He had picked the high position, eyes locked on the dry-wash trail where one of them was bound to circle wide. He had bet they'd try to outflank the place, test the cave first, thinking it was their best shot at surprise. And he was right. He spotted the 4th man then, silent and mean-eyed, slinking along the false trail Clara had scraped the night before. Silas smiled without joy. He watched as the man stepped over the snare line, exactly where they had hoped. A flick of motion, a boot heel caught the wire, and then the forest screamed. The trap clanged shut with the sound of metal splitting bone. A man's howl tore through the dawn's edge, and the hawk cried again. Back at the cabin, Toby Finch spun, eyes wild, fumbling his pistol, but not fast enough. Clara's shot cracked across the plain, clean and sharp. Toby hit the ground before he could breathe twice, his gun clattering beside him. The horse reared, then bolted, dragging a stirrup along like a broken wing. Kane shouted something, ducking low, hand going to his sidearm. But Clara was already gone from the porch, slipping through the door like smoke. Inside, the cabin was quiet as a grave. She took her place beside the window slit they'd carved out. Waited. Outside, Levi Creel ran for cover, barking orders to a ghost. He didn't know yet that half his men were already down. He didn't know he'd walked into a place where the land remembered its own, and Clara Bellwether was one of them. Up on the ridge, Silas watched Kane circle south, smart enough to know this wasn't no easy job. Kane crept behind the same rock Silas had used the night before. Silas moved. He shifted through brush and sandstone, each footstep measured, deliberate. The sun was beginning to rise now, blood-red and cruel, casting long light down into the hollows. Kane rounded the boulder too slow. Silas caught him with a hard elbow to the jaw, and the man hit the dirt with a grunt. No gunshot. Not yet. Just fists. Silas straddled him, yanked the coat back, and saw it. The gleam of another map tucked inside the lining. Different markings. New trails. Another X. Silas pressed the barrel of his Colt to Kane's temple. "Where's Gatlin?" he asked. Kane coughed blood, eyes dazed. "He's already in the house," he rasped. Silas didn't hesitate. He left Kane wheezing in the dirt and sprinted down the ridge. Back at the cabin, Clara stood in the center of the room, rifle gone. Across from her stood Horace Gatlin. The man was thicker now than she remembered from the wanted posters. Silver streaks in his beard, belly pushing against his belt, but the eyes hadn't changed. Cold, calculating, unforgiving. He had her cornered, one hand clenched tight around her throat. The other holding a pistol, so close she could feel the heat from the barrel pressing through her blouse. "You're a thorn," he growled. "You and that man you married. Thought he could crawl back to his sweetheart and play hero. Thought I wouldn't find him." Clara didn't flinch. Her hands were at her sides, fingers twitching toward the knife she had sheathed behind her hip. "You killed him," she said. Gatlin sneered. "Dug 2 bullets in his chest and left him for the vultures. Gave him a choice, gold or his honor. He picked the wrong one." Behind them, the door creaked open. Silas didn't speak. He fired. The shot hit Gatlin high in the shoulder, spinning him with a howl of rage. The second round buried itself in the man's thigh. Gatlin collapsed, wheezing, gun clattering to the floor. Clara stepped back, coughing, throat raw. Silas moved fast, closing the space, weapon still raised. Gatlin's hand twitched toward his boot. Silas kicked it aside. "You think this changes anything?" Gatlin spat. "I've got more men. I've got power." Clara moved beside Silas. Her voice was low. "You had fear. That's what kept folks quiet. But fear dies faster than gold spins." Silas knelt and rifled through Gatlin's coat. Found the gun, the second map, and something else. A thin leather-bound notebook. Names, numbers, judges, town marshals. A web of rot winding from Bitterwash to Banks in San Francisco. He held it up. This is what he was hiding. They dragged Gatlin to the porch and tied him to the post. Bleeding, snarling, useless. The marshal from Dust Creek would come, especially now, with names to protect. especially now, when silence was no longer safe. The sun broke clean over the ridge. Red light kissed the graves out back. Clara wiped blood from her chin and turned toward the pasture. The ridge breathed, and the land exhaled. Silas whispered to the canyon, "He's inside," and ran, not from fear, but from knowing he might already be too late. Horace Gatlin smelled of sweat, smoke, and victory, but Clara only saw the man who killed her husband. The sun had risen high enough now to burn through the haze left behind by the storm, casting long fingers of light across the blood-streaked porch where Gatlin sat, bound to the post, like a pig, left too long in the sun. His hat had rolled into the dirt, the crown caved in. A black smear of blood stretched down his thigh from the bullet Silas had driven through him, staining his trousers to the boot. Still, he managed a grin, the kind that didn't need lips to show its teeth. Inside the cabin, Clara stood at the window, watching. Her hands were stiff with dried blood, his and hers, and the scent of gunpowder clung to her, like the ghost of a memory she hadn't yet buried. She wasn't thinking about the shooting anymore, or even the look on Gatlin's face when he went down. She was thinking of Jedediah, of his long stride up the porch after a long ride, of how he used to lay his rifle against the doorframe and press his forehead to hers without a word. She thought of how quiet it must have been when he died. Behind her, Silas crouched near the hearth, examining the notebook they'd pulled from Gatlin's coat. It was leather-bound, worn at the edges, and filled with names, not just the kind written down, but the kind you paid to forget. Judges, marshals, railroad men, ministers. "How many of these are still breathing?" Clara asked without turning. "Too many," Silas said. He flipped another page. "Enough to make trouble, even without Gatlin standing." Her jaw clenched. "Then we make sure he never stands again." Silas didn't look up. "You want to do it?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not yet." They stepped outside together, the dry wood of the porch groaning beneath their boots. Gatlin opened one eye, face slack with pain and defiance. "Come to finish it," he rasped. "Not yet," Clara said, echoing herself. "But we're not done." Gatlin coughed, spat dark into the dust. "You ain't got the stomach." "I got a husband in the ground because of you," she said. "That's all the stomach I need." "You don't know what you're holding," Gatlin sneered, nodding toward the map Silas had rolled back into its oilskin. "That's more than just old Confederate silver. That's power, enough to buy half the state." "I'm not interested in buying anything," Silas said. "You think the law's going to protect you, after what I've got on 'em?" Clara knelt beside him. "I don't want protection," she said. "I want memory. I want justice. I want my husband's name to mean something again." Gatlin laughed, low and mean. "You think he was some kind of saint? He was a scout, a thief. He stole that map from me." "No," Silas said. "He took it, after you showed him who you really were." Gatlin's grin faded. "You think he didn't hesitate," Gatlin hissed. "He wanted to live. I saw it in his eyes. But he made the wrong call." Clara reached for the cross around her neck, not the one she wore, but Jedediah's, the one Silas had returned to her. She held it up. "He made the only call that mattered." Gatlin turned his face away. "You two think you've won," he muttered. "But I've got men in Bitter Wash. You'll be dead before the marshal gets here." "Maybe," Silas said, "but your name won't mean a damn thing when the notebook gets to the right hands." "And the map?" Gatlin asked. "You gonna hand over gold to the law?" Clara looked at Silas. He looked back. Then she said, "No, we bury it again. Deeper this time, where no one will find it." Gatlin growled. "Then you're both fools." Clara stood. Better a fool with a clean soul than a king with blood under his fingernails. They left him there, tied and broken, while they dug graves behind the barn. One for Toby Finch, one for Levi Creel, One for the silent man who died screaming in the snare trap, not because they deserved it, but because Jedediah would have insisted on it. Honor wasn't about who you spared, it was about who you buried right. Silas worked in silence, his wound reopened, but his hands steady. Clara watched him closely. He moved slower now, not just from injury, but from understanding. The kind that settles into the bones when you've crossed some invisible line between the man you were and the one who comes after. By sundown, the graves were filled, and the dirt smoothed clean. She stood for a long time, looking at them, arms crossed, Jedediah's coat hanging from her shoulders, like a weight too familiar to shed. "Thank you," she said softly. Silas shook his head. "I didn't do it for thanks. I know. That's why it means something." They sat on the porch as night rolled in, watching the stars fight their way back through the dust-heavy sky. Somewhere a coyote called. The world kept moving, just slow enough to notice. "You ever think about staying?" Clara asked. Silas didn't answer right away. "This place feels like a grave," he said finally. "It was," she replied, "for a long time." He looked at her, shadows dancing in the corners of his eyes. "Is it still?" She considered that. "No," she said. "Not anymore." He nodded slowly, as if that truth needed time to settle. "You'll need to send word to the marshal," he said. "Tomorrow. Tonight. I want quiet." They stayed that way, side by side, not speaking, not needing to. The wind blew soft through the dry grass. The boards beneath their feet creaked now and then, like the house was learning to breathe again. The oil lamp inside cast a flicker through the open doorway, and the scent of saddle soap and cedar drifted out. Clara thought of all the things left unsaid, to Jedediah, to herself, to the stranger beside her. Then, after a time, she whispered, "We finish this tomorrow. We bury the dead and light the road for the living." The war was over. The men were buried. But the dust hadn't settled. Not yet. And maybe never. Morning came slow to Dead Mare Ridge, the kind of morning that carried a hush like a prayer said too late. The sun broke like an old scar splitting through cloud, not bright, but strong in its persistence, casting long amber lines across the land. The graves behind the barn were still fresh, the soil packed down but not yet set, and Clara stood by them, one hand resting on the butt of her shovel, the other holding Jedediah's cross. She wasn't crying, hadn't in years, but her eyes burned, dry and heavy from a night without sleep. The wind pulled gently at the hem of her coat. His coat, now hers, as if trying to remind her that grief didn't stop just because justice had passed through. Ashwind stood tethered beneath the sycamore, pawing the dirt, ears twitching toward the trail beyond. He seemed restless, as if he knew something was ending. In the distance, smoke curled from the chimney, lazy and soft. Silas was inside. She could hear the occasional clink of metal on ceramic as he put away the pans, perhaps cleaned the rifle, moved like a man who didn't know what to do with stillness. The notebook had been packed, the maps folded, the rifle cleaned and laid across the mantel once more. The porch swept. All the signs of closure, or something like it, had been set in order. Clara pressed the cross to her chest and breathed deep. The soil still smelled of blood and sage. She turned back toward the cabin. Inside, Silas was rolling up his bedroll, not looking at her when she came in. His face was unreadable, the kind that had learned to hide what it didn't want found. "You're leaving," she said. He nodded, still working the leather straps. "I figured." Silas tightened the roll, tested the knot. "You've got a notebook that'll make a judge sit up straight. A map that don't belong in any man's hands. You don't need me anymore." "That's not what I asked," she said. He looked up at her then, and for a second He wasn't the drifter or the wounded soldier or the man who'd brought death to her porch. He was just a man, tired and uncertain. "I wasn't built to stay," he said quietly. "The war didn't end for me. It just moved west." Clara crossed her arms, her expression unreadable. "You could try. I don't know how." She took a slow step forward. "You knew how to ride, how to bleed, how to carry a dead man's promise across the worst land this country has to offer. Don't tell me you don't know how to stay." Silas looked away, jaw tight. "I'm not trying to disrespect what you built here. You helped defend it," she said. "That makes you part of it." He was silent. She let the quiet stretch, long and slow, until it wrapped around the edges of the cabin. "I didn't ask you to take his place," she said at last. "I know. But I never thanked you for bringing him home, even if all you brought was his horse and his cross, and a story I wish I hadn't needed to hear." Silas nodded. "You didn't have to thank me." She stepped back, gave him space, let the distance do what it needed to. He picked up the map from the table, still wrapped tight in oilskin, held it for a long moment in both hands. "I should take this," he said. "But you won't," she answered. He looked up. "It's safer here," she said. "And besides, it was never yours to begin with." He nodded once, slowly, and laid it back down. The wind caught the corner of the oilskin, fluttering it like a whisper. Ashwind snorted outside. "You riding him?" Clara asked. Silas glanced toward the door. "He came to me once. He'll carry me once more. He's still Jedediah's. He always will be." Clara stepped toward the door and paused. "Why did Jedediah trust you?" she asked. Silas looked down. His voice was soft when it came. "Because once, during a charge, I stepped in front of a bayonet meant for him. Took it through the side. Thought I was dead. But he dragged me out anyway. Said he never forgot it." Clara closed her eyes. "No," she said. "He wouldn't." Silas reached for his hat and placed it over his head. The brim shadowed his face again, the way it had the first time she saw him, riding through the storm, like a ghost. He moved to the porch, his boots scuffing the boards. She followed. Ashwind stood waiting, still and tall, nostrils flaring as Silas approached. The saddle was already secure. The reins hung loose like they had been waiting for his hands the whole time. He climbed up slow, careful not to pull too hard at the wound still healing beneath his coat. Clara stepped down off the porch and stood beside the horse. The sun behind her lit her hair like threads of gold through iron. She looked up at Silas, searching for something, maybe finding it. "If you ride east," she said, "keep to the shadow side of the canyon, less open ground." He nodded. "And if you ride west—" "I won't," he said. She smiled faintly. "Didn't think so." He tipped his hat. "Take care of the land," he said. "I've always taken care of what was mine." Silas turned Ashwind with a light pull, the horse responding without hesitation. They moved down the trail, not fast, not slow, just steady, like men who knew there was nothing left to outrun. She watched until they passed the bend beyond the sycamore, where the trail dropped out of sight. She kept watching after that, until the only thing left was dust and the sound of hoofbeats slowly fading into the canyons. The wind picked up again. She turned back toward the house. The porch stood clean, the cabin quiet. The coat still hung by the door, and the map lay tucked beneath the cross, not forgotten, just resting. She stepped inside, shut the door behind her, and leaned against it for a long breath. Outside, the land had not changed, but she had. And though the war had taken her man, it left behind one truth. Not every hero rides in with glory. Some come limping, quiet as ghosts, and leave legends in their dust. And so the wind still comes down from Deadmare Ridge, same as it always has. But if you listen close, if you stand real still in the late hush of evening, you'll hear something different carried in it now. Not sorrow, not silence, but something gentler, something like a name long buried rising to the surface again, like the memory of a wildflower that once bloomed behind a barn. No one visits anymore, and you'll think of boots scuffing over dry wood, a horse's breath in the cold, and the sound of stitching pulled tight over a wound that should have never been made in the first place, and you might remember her then, Clara Bellwether, the widow who waited past reason, past kindness, past time itself, the woman who buried love with her own 2 hands but never let the land forget him. And you'll see again the flicker of firelight in a cracked window pane, the weight of a coat that once hung heavy with memories, and a silver cross catching morning sun on a dusty mantle, not shining so much as enduring. And maybe you'll remember the man who came out of nowhere, not riding fast, not speaking loud, but bearing the kind of sorrow only the West could shape into something quiet and just. And maybe you'll hear hoofbeats that echo not in sound, but in rhythm, the way hearts remember grief even when they beat steady, and the wind, yes, it will pull at the grass, stir the dust along the fence rails, and rattle the chimes made from old casings, like a song without words. Like the hum of honor returning to a place that almost forgot it. And you'll think about how justice doesn't always come dressed in a badge or backed by a crowd, how sometimes it rides alone, wounded and unwilling, but driven by something deeper than revenge, how sometimes justice is just a woman standing on her own land with nothing but truth in her pocket and a rifle across her lap. And you'll feel it then, the ache of everything that went unsaid, of letters never written, of goodbyes never spoken, and you'll wonder how many men rode off promising to come back before the cold, and never did. How many women kept the coffee warm anyway? How many promises hung in the air like mist, waiting for someone to claim them? And you'll understand that there's a kind of strength in waiting, not the idle kind, but the kind that holds the roof down in a storm, that watches the ridge for movement even when the eyes burn. And you'll see the value in one old map hidden under floorboards, in one name scrawled in a faded ledger, in one hand refusing to pull the trigger until the truth is fully spoken. And perhaps you'll believe again that the past doesn't vanish. It settles in the bones of the land, in the grooves of a horse's trail, in the scent of scorched letters and old cedar. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that's all justice really needs. Not a court, not a crowd, just one person brave enough to remember. Brave enough to wait, brave enough to bury the dead right and ride out the silence. And if you're quiet now, if you close your eyes, you might feel it. The warmth of coffee for 2 still steaming in a cracked mug. The press of a bayonet scar against a soldier's ribs. The hush of an oil lamp in a room where a woman sits alone, but no longer hollow. And that's where the story settles, in the breath between grief and grace, where names are spoken again, not in mourning, but in respect. And where forgiveness, belated and battered, still matters, because it means something to stand your ground not in anger, but in love, because honor can be buried but not erased, because justice may come late, but when it arrives, it leaves tracks, and because sometimes the woman forgotten by the town becomes the one who saves it, quietly, fiercely, without asking for praise. And if you've made it this far, if something in this story stirred an old hope inside you, if it made you think of someone you once knew, or someone you wish you'd been brave enough to become, then leave a sign for us, a small one. Click the heart if you still believe in honor, in kindness, in love that outlives the man. And if your heart feels fuller than when you first began, we invite you to follow the trail to our next story, right here on our channel, where we keep the lamp burning and the wind speaking, for stories that still remember.